They were abandoned by their own children, left to rot in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper and broken dreams. But when an inheritance letter arrived for a property no one else wanted, what Margaret and Harold discovered buried deep in those forgotten mountains wasn't just shelter. It was $445 million in a secret vault, and the chance to rewrite the cruelest chapter of their lives. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee and loneliness. Margaret sat at the small Formica table, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, staring at a stack of unopened bills she couldn't afford to pay. The overhead light flickered the same way it had for 3 months, but calling the landlord meant hearing his voice, that tone that said she was just another burden he tolerated. She was 78 years old. Her hands, once steady enough to grade papers and braid her daughter's hair, now trembled when she held anything heavier than a teacup. Across from her, Harold sat in his recliner, the one they'd bought 30 years ago when money wasn't so tight and hope wasn't so thin. He was 81, his back bent from decades of construction work, his eyes clouded with cataracts he couldn't afford to fix. The television murmured in the background, some talk show neither of them was watching. Outside, the North Carolina autumn painted the trees in gold and rust, but inside this cramped apartment on the edge of Asheville, everything felt grey. Margaret reached for the phone, a landline because they'd never figured out those smartphones everyone carried, and stared at the keypad. She'd been thinking about calling her daughter Jessica again. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time Jessica would answer and say she was sorry, that she'd been busy, that she still cared. But Margaret's finger hovered over the buttons and never pressed down. Harold cleared his throat from across the room. "You gonna call her?" Margaret set the phone down gently like it might shatter. "No point." "Been 4 months now," Harold said quietly. 5, Margaret corrected. 5 months since Jessica had picked up the phone. 7 months since their son Daniel had returned a voicemail. A year and a half since anyone had visited for a holiday. The math of abandonment was simple and brutal, and Margaret had memorized every number. It hadn't always been this way. She remembered birthday parties in their old house, back when the kids were small and loud and everywhere. She remembered Daniel's high school graduation, the way Harold had cried when their boy walked across that stage. She remembered Jessica's wedding, the way her daughter had squeezed her hand and whispered, "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mama." But somewhere along the way the calls became shorter. The visits became excuses. Daniel moved to California for work and stopped coming home for Christmas. Jessica stayed in Charlotte, only 90 miles away, but it might as well have been another country. And then came the conversations that broke them. Daniel had called one night, his voice tight with frustration. "Dad, you can't keep living alone like this. You're getting older. You need to think about assisted living." Harold had bristled. "I'm fine. Your mother and I are fine." "You're not fine. Mom called me last week saying you fell in the garage." "I tripped. It wasn't a fall." "It's the same thing." "It's not the same damn thing." The conversation had ended with Daniel saying he'd look into facilities and Harold slamming the phone down so hard it cracked the plastic. Jessica had been worse. She'd shown up unannounced one afternoon with pamphlets, glossy brochures for retirement communities with names like Golden Horizons and Sunset Meadows, places that looked like hotels but cost more than Harold had made in 5 years of working. "Mom, you have to be realistic," Jessica had said, sitting in the very chair where Harold now sat. "You can't take care of Dad anymore. He's getting too difficult." "Difficult?" Margaret had felt her chest tighten. "He's your father, and I love him, but Mom, I have my own life. I have kids. I have a job. I can't keep coming down here every time something happens." "We're not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" Margaret had looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and seen a stranger. "Nothing," she'd said quietly. "We're not asking you for anything." Jessica had left the brochures on the table and hadn't come back. That had been 18 months ago. Now, Margaret and Harold lived in this small apartment, their savings drained from medical bills and the cost of simply existing. Harold's pension barely covered rent. Margaret's social security paid for food, but not much else. They'd sold the house, the car, most of their furniture. They'd pawned Margaret's wedding ring, though she'd cried for 3 days after. They were surviving, but barely. The mail arrived around 2 in the afternoon, slipped through the slot in the door and landing on the threadbare carpet with a soft thump. Margaret rose slowly, her knees protesting, and shuffled to the door. Bills, always bills. A flyer for a pizza place they couldn't afford, and then something different. A thick manila envelope with a law firm's return address. Caldwell and Associates, estate attorneys. Margaret frowned and brought it back to the table. Harold looked up from his recliner. "What's that?" "Don't know yet." She opened it carefully, her hands shaking more than usual. Inside was a letter on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that felt expensive. "Dear Mrs. Margaret Walsh," it began. "We are writing to inform you that you are the sole remaining heir to the estate of Mr. Raymond Walsh, deceased as of September 19th, 2024. Margaret blinked. "Raymond Walsh?" Harold sat up straighter. "Your Uncle Raymond?" "I think so. Daddy's brother. I haven't seen him since I was a little girl." She kept reading. "Mr. Walsh passed away without a will, and after extensive searches you have been identified as his closest living relative. His estate includes a property located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of this property." Margaret set the letter down. Her hands were shaking worse now, but not from age. "We inherited something," she whispered. Harold pushed himself out of the recliner and came to the table, reading over her shoulder. "A property? Where?" "Doesn't say exactly, just somewhere in the mountains." "Raymond," Harold muttered. "Wasn't he the weird one, the one who disappeared?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Daddy used to say Raymond went crazy. Moved up into the mountains back in the 70s and never came back. We always thought he was dead." "Well, now he is." Margaret looked at the letter again, her heart beating faster. This could be something. Maybe a small cabin. Maybe a piece of land they could sell. Maybe, just maybe, enough to stop the drowning feeling that came every time she opened the mailbox. "We should call them," she said. Harold nodded. Yeah, we should." The law office of Caldwell and Associates was tucked into a brick building downtown, the kind with ivy climbing the walls and brass nameplates that gleamed. Margaret and Harold took the bus there, sitting in the back, watching the city roll past. They'd dressed in their nicest clothes, which weren't very nice anymore, but they'd tried. The receptionist was kind, at least. She offered them coffee and led them to a conference room with dark wood furniture and paintings of mountains on the walls. A man in his 50s entered a few minutes later, carrying a leather folder. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Martin Caldwell. Thank you for coming in." They shook hands and sat down. Martin opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "I'll get straight to it," he said. Raymond Walsh owned a significant piece of property in the Blue Ridge Mountains, approximately 80 acres, including a structure built in 1973. "A house?" Margaret asked. "More of an estate, from what the records show. It was designed by a fairly well-known architect of that era, brutalist style, built into the mountainside." Harold frowned. "What's it worth?" Martin hesitated. "That's complicated. The property is extremely remote. There's no road access beyond a deteriorated Forest Service path. The structure has been abandoned for decades. It's likely in severe disrepair. Honestly, Mr. Walsh, the tax burden alone might not be worth assuming." Margaret felt her hope deflating like a punctured tire. "So it's worthless." "I wouldn't say worthless, but it's not something you could easily sell. And maintaining it, even just paying the property taxes, would cost several $1,000s a year. We don't have several $1,000s, Harold said bluntly. Martin nodded sympathetically. I understand. You have 3 options. 1, you can refuse the inheritance. 2, you can accept it and attempt to sell it, though I'll warn you, properties like this rarely attract buyers. Or 3, you can accept it and see what's there. Margaret and Harold looked at each other. 37 years of marriage meant they could have entire conversations without words. This one said, "We have nothing else." "We'll take it," Margaret said. Martin looked surprised. "Are you sure? Once you accept, you'll be responsible for—" "We're sure," Harold interrupted. Martin studied them for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll draw up the paperwork." They signed documents for 20 minutes, Margaret's hand cramping by the end. When they finished, Martin handed them a folder containing deeds, tax records, and a hand-drawn map. "The map is from 1974, he said. "It's the best we have. The property is about 2 hours north of here, past a town called Laurel Springs. You'll need a 4-wheel drive vehicle to get anywhere close." "We don't have a car," Margaret admitted quietly. Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "There's a man named Jack who runs a general store up in that area. He knew Raymond, apparently. He might be able to help you get up there." They thanked him and left, stepping out into the afternoon sun. Harold held the folder like it contained gold, even though they both knew it probably contained nothing but disappointment. "What do you think?" Margaret asked as they waited for the bus. Harold looked at the mountains in the distance, their peaks touching the clouds. "I think we don't have much choice. We could refuse it, not deal with the headache." "Maggie," Harold said, using the name he'd called her since they were 20. "When's the last time anyone gave us anything?" She thought about that, about Jessica's pamphlets and Daniel's impatience, about the landlord's irritation and the way the grocery store clerk looked at them when they counted out exact change, about being invisible, disposable, forgotten. "Never," she said softly. "Then let's see what we got." Calling Jack turned out to be easier than expected. The old man answered on the second ring, his voice rough as tree bark. "You Margaret Walsh's girl?" he asked. "I'm Margaret." "Well, I'll be damned. Raymond used to talk about you. Said you were the only one in the family worth a damn." Margaret felt something warm in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "You knew him?" "Knew him? Hell, I was probably his only friend for 40 years. Crazy old bastard. Brilliant, though. You coming to see the place?" "We're thinking about it." "Thinking ain't doing. You either come or you don't, but that place, it needs someone who gives a damn. Raymond, he built something special up there. Most folks thought he was nuts, but I knew better." "What did he build?" Jack laughed. "You'll see. I'll pick you up Saturday morning, 7 o'clock. Bring sturdy shoes and an open mind." He hung up before Margaret could respond. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. Margaret and Harold stood outside their apartment building at 6:45, both wearing layers and the best shoes they owned, which weren't great. A pickup truck older than some buildings rumbled up at exactly 7. Jack was everything his voice suggested, weathered, grey-bearded, wearing flannel and boots that had seen decades of mountain trails. "Hop in," he said. They drove north, the city giving way to small towns, then to nothing but trees and sky. Jack talked the whole way, telling stories about Raymond. "He showed up in 71, Jack said. Just appeared one day with a briefcase full of cash and architectural plans. Bought that land from the Forest Service for next to nothing because nobody wanted it. Too steep, too remote. But Raymond, he didn't want neighbors." "What did he do?" Harold asked. "For money, I mean." "Made a fortune in pharmaceuticals back in the 50s and 60s. Patents, research, something like that. Sold his company and disappeared. Said he was done with people. Wanted to build something for himself, by himself." They turned onto a dirt road, then onto a path that barely qualified as a road. The truck bounced and groaned, scraping against rocks and branches. Margaret held onto the door handle, her heart climbing into her throat. "How much further?" she managed. "Another mile. We'll have to walk from there." They parked where the path simply ended, swallowed by forest. Jack handed them walking sticks and started up a trail Margaret could barely see. Harold took her hand, and together they followed, step by careful step. The forest was thick with silence, broken only by their breathing and the crunch of leaves. Margaret's legs burned. Harold wheezed beside her. But Jack kept going, his pace steady, and they refused to quit. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, the trees opened up. And there it was. Margaret stopped so suddenly, Harold bumped into her. They both stood frozen, staring. The estate wasn't just a house. It was a structure that seemed to grow from the mountain itself, all concrete and glass and impossible angles. Brutalist architecture, Martin had called it, but the word didn't capture the raw power of it. Multiple levels cascaded down the mountainside, connected by concrete walkways and glass bridges. Vines and moss covered much of it now, like the forest was slowly reclaiming what Raymond had built. But even through the decay, you could see the vision. It was magnificent. "Holy hell," Harold whispered. Jack grinned. Raymond designed every inch of it himself, worked with some famous architect from Europe to make it happen. Took 3 years to build, hauling every piece of material up on mules and his own back. Folks thought he'd lost his mind. Margaret walked forward slowly, drawn by something she couldn't name. The main entrance was a massive concrete door, slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. "Is it safe?" she asked. "Safe enough. Structure's solid. Raymond built things to last." They stepped inside, and Margaret's breath caught. The interior was like stepping into a time capsule. Mid-century furniture sat exactly where it had been left, covered in dust but intact. Built-in bookshelves lined entire walls, filled with volumes. A fireplace made of stacked stone dominated one wall. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the mountain view like living paintings. "Why would he leave all this?" Margaret whispered, running her finger along a teak credenza. "He didn't," Jack said quietly. "He died here. I found him myself 2 months back. He was 87, went peaceful in his sleep." They moved through the rooms slowly, discovering more with each step. A kitchen with avocado-green appliances that probably hadn't worked in decades but were pristine. A library with a rolling ladder and thousands of books. Bedrooms with platform beds and geometric light fixtures. Bathrooms with sunken tubs and tile that must have cost a fortune. In the main living area, Harold stopped in front of a wall of photographs. Black and white images showed Raymond building this place. A thin man with intense eyes, shirtless and covered in sweat, laying concrete, hauling beams, working completely alone. "He did this all by himself?" Harold asked. Jack nodded. "Had some help with the heavy machinery, but mostly, yeah. 10 years he lived up here, building and reading and thinking. Then he just stayed. Never left, not once in 40 years. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because Raymond had built something permanent when everything in her life felt temporary. Maybe because he'd been abandoned by family too, but he'd made that abandonment into something powerful. "There's more," Jack said, watching her face. "But I think you two need to find it yourselves." "What do you mean?" Harold asked. Jack smiled. "Raymond was a genius, and geniuses hide things. He told me once, years ago, that if anything happened to him, whoever inherited this place would find what they needed when they needed it most." He tapped his temple. He was cryptic like that. "But what—" "I've said enough." Jack checked his watch. "I've got to get back down before dark. You two take your time, look around. Door locks from the inside. I'll come back for you tomorrow morning, same time." "Wait," Margaret said. "You're leaving us here?" "Raymond left you this place, Maggie. It's yours now. Might as well spend a night in it." Before they could protest, Jack was gone, his footsteps fading down the trail. Margaret and Harold stood alone in the massive space, the silence pressing in on them like water. Well, Harold said eventually, guess we're camping. What happens next will turn this abandoned estate into something far more valuable than either of them could imagine, reveal a secret that had been hidden for decades, and transform two forgotten souls into the guardians of a fortune. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They spent the afternoon exploring. Every room held something new. A wine cellar stocked with bottles covered in decades of dust, closets filled with expensive clothes that smelled like cedar and thyme, an office with a desk the size of a small car, and filing cabinets filled with documents they didn't understand. Margaret found a bedroom that must have been Raymond's. The bed was made with military precision. On the nightstand sat a single photograph in a silver frame, a family portrait from what looked like the 1940s. She recognized her father as a young boy, standing next to an older boy who must have been Raymond. They were smiling. She picked up the frame carefully. "He kept this," she whispered, "all these years." Harold came up behind her. Maybe he wasn't as alone as everyone thought. He was alone, but he chose it. "That's different than having it chosen for you." Margaret set the frame down and turned to her husband. Harold's eyes were damp, and she realized hers were too. They were both thinking the same thing, about Jessica and Daniel, about the apartment with the flickering light, about everything they'd lost. "We're here now," Harold said, pulling her close. They held each other in that strange, magnificent house, two people who'd been discarded finding shelter in a place built by someone who understood. As evening fell, they found candles and matches in the kitchen. The electricity was dead, but the propane stove somehow still worked, and they heated up the canned soup they'd brought in their backpack. They ate sitting on the floor of the main room, watching the mountains turn purple through the massive windows. "It's beautiful," Margaret said. "It is. But we can't keep it. We can't afford the taxes, can't afford to fix anything. We'll have to sell." "Who's going to buy a concrete fortress in the middle of nowhere?" "I don't know, but Harold, we can't stay here. We can barely walk up here." Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What if we could?" "What?" "What if we could stay? What if there's something here that makes it possible?" "Like what? Magic?" "Like what Jack said. Raymond hid something for whoever came next." Margaret wanted to dismiss it, but something in her chest pulled tight. She thought about the careful way Raymond had preserved everything, the way he'd kept that family photo, the way Jack had smiled when he said they'd find what they needed. "Where would we even start looking?" she asked. Harold stood up, his knees cracking. "We start by paying attention. Raymond was an engineer, a scientist. He wouldn't hide something random. He'd make it logical." They started in the office. Harold went through the filing cabinets while Margaret examined the desk. Papers, receipts, old letters, tax documents from decades ago. Everything was organized with obsessive precision. Dates, categories, everything labeled. "He kept every record," Harold muttered. Power bills from 1983, property tax receipts going back to the purchase, medical records. Why keep all this? Margaret wondered. Because he could. Because up here he could control everything. Margaret opened the desk drawers one by one. Pens, paper clips, rubber bands, all organized in small containers. Then, in the bottom drawer, something different. A leather journal, thick and worn. She opened it carefully. Raymond's handwriting filled the pages, small and precise. Dates marked each entry. Journal-style observations about weather, about construction progress, about thoughts that wandered from philosophy to physics to loneliness. She flipped to the last entry, dated 3 months before he died. "I'm 87 years old, and I've lived alone for 43 years. People would call that sad. I call it intentional. I built this place to last beyond me. I built it as a monument to solitude, but also to hope, because I know that someday someone will find what I've left behind. Someone who needs it more than I ever did. Someone who understands that value isn't just about money, it's about meaning. The vault contains more than wealth. It contains possibility. But you have to earn it. You have to prove you're willing to look beyond the obvious. Margaret's hands shook. Harold! He came over immediately, reading over her shoulder. When he finished, they looked at each other. A vault, Margaret whispered. They searched for hours. They moved furniture, checked walls, examined floors. The house was massive, with multiple levels and dozens of rooms. Every surface was concrete or glass or wood, all of it solid, revealing nothing. At midnight, exhausted and frustrated, they collapsed on the sofa in the main room. Dust puffed up around them. Maybe we're wrong, Margaret said. Maybe he was just a lonely old man who wrote in a journal. Harold stared at the ceiling, his mind working. Then he sat up suddenly. The books. What? In the library. He had thousands of books. Why would you haul thousands of books up a mountain? They went to the library, their candle casting wild shadows. The room was wall-to-wall shelves, floor to ceiling, every shelf packed tight. Harold started pulling books out randomly, checking behind them. Margaret did the same. Most were what you'd expect: philosophy, science, history. But then Margaret found a section that was different. These books weren't organized by subject or author. They were organized by color, all black spines, all in a row. Harold, look at this. He came over. They counted. 24 books, all with black spines, all the same size. Harold pulled one out. It was a dummy, just a shell with nothing inside. He pulled another. Same thing. They're not real books, he said. Margaret pulled out the entire row. Behind them was not the concrete wall they expected, but wood. Dark wood paneling that didn't match anything else in the house. Harold pressed against it. It's hollow. They looked at each other in the candlelight, hearts pounding. Harold pushed harder, then slid his fingers along the edge, searching for a release, a button, anything. Click. The panel shifted inward an inch, then slid sideways, revealing darkness beyond. Margaret held up the candle. Behind the panel was a steel door, industrial and cold, with a combination dial in the center. Oh my God, she breathed. They stood there, staring at the door, at the proof that Raymond's words weren't the ramblings of loneliness. He'd hidden something, something important enough to seal behind fake books and a steel door. Now what? Harold asked. Margaret thought about the journal, about Raymond's precise mind. He said we had to earn it, that we had to look beyond the obvious. The combination could be anything. No. Margaret shook her head. Not anything. Something meaningful. Something that makes sense. They went back to the journal, reading by candlelight, searching for numbers. Dates appeared everywhere. Construction dates, his birthday, the date he moved to the mountain. But which one? Then Margaret saw it. On the very first page, before any entries, Raymond had written something in different ink, like he'd added it later. To my family, who forgot me, and to whoever comes after, who might not. Below that, 9/1973. September 19th, 1973, Margaret read. That's when he finished building this place. They went back to the vault door. Harold's hands shook as he spun the dial. Right to 9, left past 9 to 19, right to 73. Nothing. He tried again, slower. 9/1973. Still nothing. Margaret stared at the numbers, her mind racing. Then she remembered. Martin had said Raymond died on September 19th, 2024, the same month and day, 51 years later. Try the death date, she said, 9/1924. Harold spun the dial. 9/1924. The lock clicked. They froze, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Then Harold grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a pneumatic hiss, as if it had been sealed airtight. Cool air rushed out, dry and preserved. Margaret raised the candle and they peered inside. What they saw stole every word from their mouths. The vault was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, lined with steel shelves. But those shelves held the impossible. Stacks of cash bundled in bank wrappers filled the bottom shelves. Thousands of bundles, all hundreds, all old but pristine. Gold bars, small but heavy, lined the next shelf up. Margaret counted 12 of them, glinting in the candlelight like ancient treasure. But that was just the beginning. Boxes labeled in Raymond's careful handwriting. Bearer bonds, stock certificates, jewelry, documents. Painting tubes stood in one corner, the kind museums use to transport valuable artwork. A small safe sat in the back, its door open, revealing stacks of papers that looked like legal documents and more stock certificates. Margaret stepped inside, her legs barely holding her. She picked up one bundle of cash, $50,000, the wrapper said. She set it down and picked up another, 50,000. Another, 50,000. "Harold," she whispered, "how much is here?" Harold couldn't speak. He was staring at a piece of paper taped to the wall, right at eye level. They both moved to read it. "If you're reading this, you found it. Good. That means you're smarter than the jackals who called themselves my family. Everything in this vault is yours now, legally and morally. I made my money honestly, invested it wisely, and had no one to leave it to. The cash is old but still good. The gold is real. The bonds mature in 2025. The stocks are from companies that will still exist when you find this. The art is valuable, but only if you care about such things. Total conservative estimate, $445 million. You're rich now, but more importantly, you're free. Use it wisely. Use it well. And for God's sake, use it to live, not just survive." Raymond Walsh, July 2024. Margaret's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the steel floor, the candle trembling in her hand. Harold leaned against the wall, his face white even in the golden light. $445 million, Margaret whispered. "That's not possible. It's right here." They sat in silence, surrounded by more wealth than they'd seen in their entire lives combined. More than they'd even imagined. Enough to change everything. Enough to fix everything. Enough to prove to every person who'd ever dismissed them that they mattered. Finally, Harold spoke. "What do we do?" Margaret looked at him, her husband of 37 years, the man who'd stood beside her through every disappointment and every joy. His eyes were full of tears. So were hers. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know." Outside, the mountain night pressed against the windows. Inside, two people who'd been abandoned and forgotten sat in a vault full of enough money to buy kingdoms, and neither of them had any idea what came next. But for the first time in years, the weight on their shoulders felt a little lighter, because whatever happened now, they had a choice. They had power. They had a future beyond bills and broken lights and children who'd stopped calling. Raymond Walsh, the lonely genius who'd built a fortress in the mountains, had given them more than money. He'd given them hope. And as Margaret and Harold sat there in the candlelight, surrounded by treasure and possibility, they began to understand that the real inheritance wasn't in the vault. It was in the proof that they deserved better than what they'd been given, that they mattered, that their lives weren't over, that somewhere someone had thought they were worth saving. And in that moment, surrounded by millions they never asked for and a legacy they never expected, Margaret and Harold Walsh finally felt like they'd come home. They didn't sleep. How could they? Margaret and Harold sat in the library until dawn, the vault door hanging open behind them like a mouthful of secrets. The candles burned down to stubs, then darkness took over, then finally grey light began filtering through the windows. Neither of them had gone back into the vault after that first look. It felt too big, too impossible. Like if they stared at it too long, it might disappear or reveal itself as some elaborate dream they'd both fallen into. Harold stood first, his joints protesting. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains emerging from the darkness. "Jack's coming back in a few hours." Margaret nodded, still sitting on the floor, her back against Raymond's desk. What do we tell him? I don't know. He knew Raymond for 40 years. He might know about this. Or he might not. Harold turned from the window. Raymond kept that journal. He sealed that vault. He wrote that note specifically for whoever inherited this place. That doesn't sound like someone who told his only friend about his fortune. Margaret stood slowly, bones aching. She was 78 years old, and she'd just spent the night on a concrete floor after hiking up a mountain. Every part of her body screamed. But her mind was sharper than it had been in years. We need to think this through, she said. We can't just walk down that mountain with gold bars in our pockets. We can't leave it here either. Why not? It's been here for decades. It's not going anywhere. Harold considered that. So what's the plan? We just act normal? Pretend we didn't find anything? Until we figure out what to do, yes. Margaret moved to the vault and looked inside again, making sure it was still real. It was. We need lawyers, financial people. We need to understand what we actually have and how to claim it without losing half to taxes or thieves or both. We don't know any lawyers we can trust. Then we find some. But Harold, we have to be smart about this. One wrong move and we could lose everything. Or worse. Worse. Margaret thought about the stories she'd heard over the years, about lottery winners who ended up broke or dead, about people who came into money and found themselves surrounded by vultures. People do terrible things for this kind of money. Our own children abandoned us over the cost of a phone call. What would they do for $445 million? The question hung in the air like smoke. Harold closed the vault door carefully, spun the combination dial. The panel slid back into place, and Margaret replaced the fake books. Within minutes, the library looked exactly as it had before, giving away nothing. We document everything, Harold said, his construction foreman instincts kicking in. We photograph every item, count every bill, inventory every stock certificate. We do it methodically, and we do it without anyone knowing. Margaret found paper and a pen in Raymond's desk. She started making lists, her teacher's handwriting still precise despite her shaking hands. Priorities, she wrote at the top. Then numbered below. 1. Document contents. 2. Research legal requirements. 3. Secure the property. 4. Find trustworthy professionals. 5. Tell no one. She underlined that last one twice. Jack's truck rumbled up at exactly 7 o'clock. Margaret and Harold were waiting outside, looking tired but calm. They'd spent the last hour hiding any evidence of their discovery, making sure everything looked untouched. "How was your night?" Jack asked, as they climbed into the truck. "Cold," Harold said honestly, "but the structure's solid, no leaks, no collapses. Told you Raymond built to last." Jack started back down the mountain path. "So what do you think? You going to keep it or sell?" Margaret and Harold had rehearsed this. "We don't know yet," Margaret said. "It's overwhelming. We need time to think." Understandable. Place like that, it's a lot to take on. "Did Raymond ever talk about what he wanted done with it?" Harold asked carefully. Jack was quiet for a moment, navigating around a fallen branch. He said once that he hoped whoever got it would see it for what it was. Not just concrete and glass, but a statement. He said he built it to prove you could make something permanent in a temporary world. "Did he have much money?" Margaret tried to sound casual. "To maintain it, I mean." "Enough, I guess. He lived simple. Grew his own food in the summer, hunted in the winter. Didn't need much. His pension from his old company covered the taxes and basics." Jack glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "Why? You worried about costs?" "We're worried about everything," Margaret admitted. "We're two old people on Social Security. Keeping up a place like that might be impossible." "Might be," Jack agreed. "But then again, Raymond was full of surprises. Wouldn't shock me if he left you something to help with that." Margaret's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Jack shrugged. Just a feeling. Raymond, he wasn't the type to give someone a problem without also giving them a solution. But hell, I'm just an old man who runs a general store. What do I know? They rode the rest of the way in silence. Back at the apartment, Margaret and Harold sat at their small table, the manila folder from the lawyer between them. Everything they owned fit in this tiny space. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a recliner, a television, clothes that fit in one closet. Their entire life compressed into 600 square feet of temporary shelter. But somewhere up in those mountains, they owned 80 acres and a fortune that could buy this entire building 100 times over. "We need to go back," Harold said, "soon, before someone else discovers it." "How?" "Jack's the only one who knows how to get there, and we can't keep asking him to drive us without raising suspicion." Harold thought about that. "We buy a truck, something with 4-wheel drive. Tell people we're thinking about fixing up the property, that we need transportation." "With what money?" "We have $3,000 left in savings." "Harold, that's for emergencies." "Maggie, this is an emergency. We have $445 million sitting in an unlocked vault in an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. Every day we wait is a day someone could stumble onto it." He was right. Margaret hated it, but he was right. The next morning, they took the bus to a used car dealership on the edge of town. The salesman looked at them like they were ghosts who'd wandered in by mistake, but when Harold pulled out cash, his attitude changed fast. They drove away in a 2008 Ford Ranger, dark green, with 183,000 miles on it, but an engine that purred. Harold hadn't driven in 6 months, but muscle memory took over. They made it back to the apartment without incident. "Tomorrow," Harold said, parking in their assigned spot. "We go back tomorrow." That night, Margaret couldn't eat. She pushed food around her plate, her mind up in those mountains. Harold noticed, but didn't push. He understood. They were standing on the edge of something enormous, and one wrong step could send them tumbling. "What if it's a trick?" Margaret asked suddenly. "What? What if Raymond set this up as some kind of test? What if the moment we try to take anything, alarms go off or police show up, or the whole thing was fake?" Harold set down his fork. "Then we'll deal with it. But Maggie, that note he left, that wasn't a trick. That was a lonely man trying to give meaning to his life by helping whoever came next. We don't deserve this. Maybe not, but we got it anyway." They left before dawn, the truck loaded with supplies. Flashlights, batteries, trash bags, a camera, notebooks, a sleeping bag, in case they needed to stay overnight again. The drive took 2 hours, the last 40 minutes on increasingly rough roads that made the truck groan. When they finally parked where the path ended, Margaret sat for a moment, staring up at the trees. "This is really happening." "Yes, it is." They hiked up, slower than with Jack, but steadier. This time they knew what waited at the top. When the estate came into view, it looked different in daylight, less imposing, more like what it was. A house. An extraordinary house, but still just a place where a man had lived and died. Inside, dust motes danced in the morning light. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. They went straight to the library, moved the books, opened the panel, spun the combination. 9/1924. Click. The vault opened, and there it was, still real, still impossible. Harold pulled out the camera they'd bought at a pawn shop for $25. "We start with the cash. Count every bundle, photograph every stack." They worked for hours. The cash alone took until early afternoon. Bundle after bundle, all hundreds, all in bank wrappers from various years spanning the 1980s through the 2000s. Harold counted while Margaret documented 50,000 per bundle, 238 bundles total. "That's $11,900,000, Margaret said, her voice hollow. "Just in cash." The gold bars came next. 12 of them, each stamped with weight and purity. Harold photographed the stamps. 1 kilogram, 999.9 fine gold. Margaret wrote it down with shaking hands. Gold's worth about $60,000 per kilogram right now, Harold said. He'd looked it up at the library before they left. That's another $720,000. The stock certificates were harder. Boxes and boxes of them, hundreds of pages. Companies Margaret recognized: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. Purchase dates going back decades before any of them were worth anything. Harold photographed every page while Margaret tried to estimate their value, but the numbers got too big, too fast. Millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions just in stocks. What happens next will force Margaret and Harold to make impossible decisions about trust, family, and what really matters when you suddenly have everything you've ever needed, but no one to share it with. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The bearer bonds were from the 1980s and 90s, issued by corporations and municipalities. Some had matured, some were still active. Harold stacked them carefully while Margaret photographed. Face values ranged from $10,000 to $1 million each. There were 83 of them. "I don't even know how you cash these," Margaret admitted. "We'll figure it out." The jewelry box contained items that looked like they belonged in a museum. Diamond necklaces, gold watches, rings with stones the size of Margaret's thumbnail. Some pieces had documentation, authenticity certificates from auction houses and jewelers. Harold recognized a few brand names: Cartier, Van Cleef, and Arpels, Patek Philippe. Why would he buy all this just to hide it? Margaret wondered. Maybe it wasn't about the jewelry. Maybe it was about converting money into things that would hold value. The painting tubes held 6 rolled canvases. They were too afraid to unroll them fully, but the documentation attached to each tube told the story. Works by artists Margaret had heard of in college art history classes. Mid-century American painters whose work now sold for millions. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon and they were surrounded by paper, photographs, lists, calculations. Harold sat back against the steel wall of the vault, exhausted. "We need an expert," he said. "Someone who knows about estates and inheritances and taxes." "We need several experts," Margaret corrected. "Financial advisors, lawyers, accountants. And we need to make sure none of them talk to each other until we understand what we're dealing with." "How do we find people like that?" "Carefully." They spent the night at the estate again, this time in Raymond's bedroom. The bed was more comfortable than their apartment mattress, and despite everything, they both slept deeply. When Margaret woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and Harold was already up, standing at the glass wall, looking out at the mountains. "You okay?" she asked. "I keep thinking about our kids," he said quietly, "about how they'll react when they find out." Margaret joined him at the window. "They don't get to know, not yet, maybe not ever." "Maggie?" "They abandoned us, Harold. They looked at us and decided we weren't worth their time. Daniel hasn't called in 7 months. Jessica lives 90 miles away and acts like we're on another planet. They don't get to swoop in now because we have money. They're still our children." "Are they?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Because I'm not sure anymore. I think maybe we were just obligations they got tired of carrying." Harold pulled her close. They stood like that for a long time, 2 people who'd given everything to raise children who'd walked away. And now they had more money than those children would earn in 100 lifetimes, and they couldn't share it with them, not without inviting back the people who'd hurt them most. "We'll figure it out," Harold said finally. "One step at a time." They spent the morning exploring parts of the estate they'd missed. The lower level had a workshop with tools still hanging on pegboards, a pottery studio with a kiln and wheel, a darkroom for developing photographs. Raymond had been a man of many interests, all pursued in solitude. In the workshop, Harold found another journal, this one focused on the house itself, maintenance logs, repair notes, upgrades he'd made over the years. The last entry was from 2 months before he died. Roof inspection complete. No leaks. Structure sound for another decade minimum. Solar panels still generating adequate power to back up battery system. Well water clean and clear. This place will outlast me by generations. Good. There are solar panels? Margaret asked. Harold looked up. Must be. Which means this place has electricity. We just don't know how to turn it on. They searched and found it in a utility room they'd overlooked. A complex system of batteries, inverters, and control panels. Harold, who'd wired houses for 30 years, studied it carefully. Then he flipped a series of switches. Lights came on throughout the house, soft but real. The refrigerator hummed to life. Air circulation systems kicked in. He built this place to run forever, Harold breathed. Completely off-grid, solar power, well water, septic system. You could live here without ever depending on the outside world. Margaret walked through the suddenly illuminated rooms, seeing details she'd missed in the candlelight and shadows. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every detail considered, every system designed for longevity and independence. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress of self-sufficiency. In Raymond's office, with the lights now on, Margaret noticed something she'd missed before. Behind his desk hung a series of framed documents, patents. She moved closer to read them. Pharmaceutical patents from the 1950s and 60s, all issued to Raymond Walsh. Chemical compounds with names she couldn't pronounce, and at the bottom of each the same note. Licensed to Merck Pharmaceutical, 1,963. Licensed to Pfizer, 1,967. He invented drugs, she said aloud. Important ones. Harold came to look. That's how he made his money. He invented things that saved lives, sold the rights, and disappeared with the profits. Why disappear, though? Why not stay and keep inventing? Harold pointed to a photograph on the wall Margaret hadn't noticed. It showed Raymond as a younger man, maybe 40, standing with other men in suits at what looked like a corporate event. He was smiling, but his eyes looked dead. Beneath it, a caption, Walsh Pharmaceutical Board Meeting, 1970. 1 month before Raymond Walsh resigned from all positions and vanished from public life. Maybe he got tired of board meetings, Harold suggested. Tired of people who cared more about profits than patients. Margaret thought about that. About a brilliant man who'd made a fortune helping people, then walked away from it all to build a fortress where no one could reach him. It was sad and beautiful at the same time. They found more that day. Hidden in various places throughout the house were small caches of cash, maybe 20,000 here, 30,000 there. Emergency funds, Margaret realized. Raymond had been preparing for anything. They also found his will, or rather, a note about his will, tucked into a leather folder in his desk. It was handwritten, dated 6 months before he died. I never filed an official will because I wanted the state to handle distribution naturally. I researched the inheritance laws carefully. With no spouse, no children, no siblings, and no living parents, my estate would eventually trace back to my brother's line. That means his grandchildren. I hope one of them is worth a damn. I hope they find what I've left and use it to build something real. But if they just sell it all for quick money, well, that's their choice. At least I tried. He planned all of this, Margaret whispered, years ago. He set it up so whoever inherited would have to work to find it, would have to prove they cared enough to look. And we did, Harold said. We looked. They sat together in the office as afternoon turned to evening. The mountains outside glowed orange and purple. The house hummed quietly around them, solar-powered and patient. We need to make decisions, Margaret said finally. We can't keep coming up here in secret forever. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we can't tell anyone about the money, not yet, but we can tell people we're moving here, that we inherited this place and we're going to try living in it. That way we have a reason to be here, to spend time securing everything. People will think we're crazy. Let them. We've been called worse. Harold smiled, When do we tell the kids? Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, when they earn it, when they prove they care about us as people, not as sources of money or convenience. If that day comes, we'll tell them. If it doesn't, they'll find out when we die. It was harsh, but Harold didn't argue. He'd felt the sting of abandonment just as deeply. We'll need help, though, he said. We can't manage $445 million alone. We'll make mistakes, lose money, maybe lose everything. We'll find help, but we'll be careful. We'll interview people, check references, make them prove they're trustworthy before we show them anything real. They spent one more night at the estate. This time, with power running, they had lights and could see everything clearly. Margaret cooked a simple meal using canned goods from their supplies and the now working stove. They ate at Raymond's table, looking out at the mountains through walls of glass. He must have been lonely, Margaret said softly. Probably. But he chose it. That's different. Is it better, though? Harold thought about that. I don't know. Maybe it's just different. After dinner, they walked through the house, turning off lights they didn't need, conserving power. In the library, Margaret paused at the vault entrance. Should we move it? The money? Bring it down to a bank? And tell them what? That we found $445 million in cash, gold, and securities in a mountain fortress? They'd call the police, the IRS, probably the FBI. So we leave it here. For now, until we understand the legal implications, until we have professionals who can guide us through claiming it properly. Margaret nodded, but she felt uneasy. All that wealth just sitting there, protected only by a combination lock and isolation. As if reading her mind, Harold said, We'll upgrade security. Cameras, better locks, maybe even an alarm system. I can install it myself. Harold, you're 81. So, I've still got my skills, and now I've got a reason to use them. They locked up carefully before they left the next morning, checking every door, every window. The estate sat silent behind them as they hiked down the mountain path. Neither of them spoke. They were both thinking the same thing. Their lives had changed completely in 72 hours, and they hadn't told a single soul. The drive back to Asheville felt longer than usual. Reality pressed in on them as the city limits appeared. They'd been living in a fairy tale up in those mountains, but now they had to function in the real world. Pay rent on an apartment they'd probably leave soon. Buy groceries with money they still didn't have while sitting on millions they couldn't touch. Act normal when everything was different. Margaret called the law office from a payphone at a gas station. Martin Caldwell answered on the third ring. Mr. Caldwell, it's Margaret Walsh. My husband and I have decided to keep the property. We'd like to move forward with securing the title and understanding our responsibilities. That's wonderful, Mrs. Walsh. When would you like to come in? As soon as possible. They met the next day. Martin seemed genuinely pleased, though surprised. Most people in your position would have walked away. That property is a significant undertaking. We understand, Margaret said, but we think it's worth it. We'd like to know about property taxes, maintenance requirements, legal obligations. Martin pulled out a folder. The property taxes are approximately $4,800 annually. Water is from a private well, so no utility bills there. Electricity would need to be restored or established, which could be costly given the remote location. The electricity works, Harold said. Solar panels and batteries. Raymond set it up years ago. Martin blinked. Oh, well, that's fortunate. Then your main costs would be taxes, basic maintenance, and travel to and from the property. We're thinking of living there, Margaret said. Martin's pen stopped moving. Living there, full time. We're considering it. Mrs. Walsh, with all due respect, you and your husband are old, Margaret finished. Yes, we're aware, but we're also capable of making our own decisions. Martin held up his hands. Of course, I just want to make sure you understand the challenges. Medical care would be hours away. Winters are harsh at that elevation. If something happened, then something happens, Harold interrupted. We'd rather die in a beautiful place we own than waste away in an apartment we can't afford, surrounded by people who don't care if we exist. The bluntness of it silenced Martin. He looked at them both, really looked, and maybe saw them for the first time. Not as elderly clients to be managed, but as people making a choice about how to live whatever time they had left. All right, he said quietly. Let's make sure everything is properly documented and legally sound. They spent 2 hours going over papers, signing documents, understanding the full scope of what they now owned. When they finally left the office, the property was officially and completely theirs. 80 acres, one architectural marvel, and a secret worth $445 million. Back at the apartment, Margaret started packing. They didn't have much, so it wouldn't take long. Clothes, a few photographs, Harold's tools, her books. Everything else was just stuff that filled space. What do we tell the landlord? Harold asked. That we're moving? That we've inherited a property and we're leaving? He'll want to keep the deposit. Let him have it. We have bigger concerns. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. At the top she wrote, Plan. Below it, she started listing steps. 1. Secure the estate. Improve locks, install security measures, make sure no one can access the vault. 2. Research financial advisors and estate lawyers. Find professionals with excellent reputations who specialize in large inheritances. 3. Begin the legal process of claiming the assets in the vault. Understand tax implications, legal requirements, proper documentation. 4. Decide what to do with the wealth. Invest, donate, save, use. 5. Decide who, if anyone, to tell. She stared at that last item for a long time. Then she added, 6. Build a life worth living. Beside her, Harold had fallen asleep in his recliner, his mouth slightly open, his hands folded across his chest. He looked old and tired and beautiful. Margaret felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. After 37 years together, they were about to start a completely new chapter, and they were doing it together. She thought about calling Jessica, about reaching out one more time. But what would she say? We inherited a house. We're moving. Jessica would probably say, That's nice, Mum, and hang up within 2 minutes. Or worse, she'd see it as one more burden her elderly parents were taking on, one more sign they needed to be in managed care. No, Margaret wouldn't call. Not yet. Not until she and Harold had established themselves, had proven they could do this. Then maybe she'd reach out. But on her terms, not as someone begging for scraps of attention, but as someone offering something real. She looked around the apartment, at the peeling wallpaper and the flickering light and the water stain on the ceiling that had been growing for months. This had been their life, small, contained, shrinking. But up in those mountains was something different, something vast and full of possibility, a fortress built by a lonely genius who'd decided that solitude was better than compromise. And now it belonged to 2 people who understood finally what Raymond had known all along. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to walk away from everything that makes you small. Margaret turned off the light and went to bed. Tomorrow they'd start moving. Tomorrow they'd begin the process of claiming not just a fortune, but a life. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, in this cramped apartment that smelled like regret and resignation, Margaret Walsh fell asleep smiling. Because for the first time in years, she had something most people never find. She had hope. And with $445 million hidden in a mountain fortress, she also had the means to make that hope into something real. The move happened quietly over 3 days. Margaret and Harold loaded the old Ford Ranger with boxes, drove 2 hours north, unloaded, then drove back. The apartment grew emptier with each trip until all that remained were furniture they didn't want and memories they couldn't pack. The landlord barely looked at them when they turned in the keys. "Good luck," he muttered, not meaning it. Harold almost laughed. Luck had nothing to do with what they'd found. By the end of the first week living at the estate, they'd established a routine. Harold spent mornings working on security, installing new locks he'd bought with cash at a hardware store in Laurel Springs. Margaret organized the house, cleaning decades of dust, making livable what had been frozen in time. They slept in Raymond's bedroom, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the mountains like a painting that changed every hour. They ate simple meals in the kitchen with the avocado-green appliances that somehow still worked. And every evening, they sat in the library and planned. "We need to start converting some of the cash," Harold said one night. "We can't keep driving 2 hours every time we need groceries." "We can't just deposit $11 million either," Margaret replied. "That would trigger every alarm the IRS has." "Not all of it. Small amounts, a few thousand here and there. Pay the property taxes in cash. Buy what we need locally. Nothing that raises eyebrows." Margaret made notes. "We'll need a story, if people ask where the money came from. We found it in the house, Raymond's savings. He lived frugally for 40 years, had money tucked away." "How much money?" Harold thought about it. 50,000. That's believable. Enough to fix up the place and live on for a year or two while we figure things out. They practiced the story until it sounded natural. Then Margaret made the drive into Laurel Springs alone, the first time she'd driven that far since they'd moved. The town was small, maybe 800 people, with a main street that had a general store, a post office, a diner, and not much else. Margaret parked in front of the general store, recognizing it as Jack's place. Inside, the smell of coffee and sawdust greeted her. Jack looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Well, look who's back. You two decide to keep the place after all." "We did," Margaret said. "We're living there now." Jack's eyebrows rose. "Living there? Full-time?" "Yes, sir. Harold's fixing it up. I'm cleaning. We figured at our age we might as well spend our time somewhere beautiful." "Can't argue with that logic." Jack rang up her groceries, staples mostly, canned goods and rice and coffee. "Folks around here will be glad to see the place occupied. Raymond would have liked that too." Margaret paid in cash, 3 20s for a $57 purchase. Jack made change without comment, but she saw him glance at the bills. They were old hundreds she'd broken at a gas station on the way down. "Found a little money in the house," she said casually, sticking to the script. "Raymond's savings, tucked away in various places. Not much, but enough to help us get settled." Jack nodded slowly. Raymond was careful with money. Doesn't surprise me he'd have some set aside. Margaret left feeling good about the interaction. Natural, easy, believable, but words spread faster than she expected. By the end of the week, when Harold went into town for supplies, the woman at the post office asked about the money they'd found. The man at the hardware store mentioned he'd heard they were fixing up the old Walsh place with cash Raymond had hidden. Even the waitress at the diner, when Margaret stopped for lunch, said she'd heard they'd found quite a bit tucked away up there. "Small towns," Harold muttered that night. "Everyone knows everything." "As long as they think it's just 50,000, we're fine," Margaret reasoned. "That's the story. We stick to it." But then the phone rang. They'd set up a landline, one of the few modern additions to the house. Margaret answered, expecting maybe Jack or the propane delivery service. "Mom?" Margaret's breath caught. "Jessica?" "Yeah, it's me." Her daughter's voice sounded strange, tight. "I heard you moved." "How did you hear that?" "Daniel called me. Someone from Asheville told someone he knows that you and Dad left your apartment. I called your old number and it was disconnected. I had to track down your new number through the property records." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Property records, public information. Anyone could access them. We inherited a house, Margaret said carefully, from your grandfather's brother Raymond. We decided to move into it. You inherited a house and didn't tell us? You haven't called in 5 months, Jessica. We didn't think you'd be interested. Silence on the other end. Then, I've been busy, Mum. Work has been crazy. I'm sure. Look, I'm calling now, aren't I? I want to see this place. Make sure you and Dad are okay. Daniel wants to come too. Margaret's stomach dropped. That's not necessary. Mom, you're 78 and Dad's 81. You moved to the middle of nowhere. We're worried. Worried. Now they were worried. After months of silence, after years of slowly backing away, now suddenly they cared. We're fine, Margaret said firmly. Better than fine. We're happy here. I'm coming up this weekend. Daniel's flying in. We'll both come see you Saturday. Jessica, we don't want... Saturday, Mum. Text me the address. I love you. She hung up before Margaret could respond. Margaret set the phone down slowly, her hands shaking. Harold looked up from the book he'd been reading. The kids? He asked. She nodded. They heard we inherited something. They're coming Saturday. Harold's jaw tightened. Of course they are. They spent the next 2 days in a panic they tried to hide from each other. Harold triple-checked the vault, made sure the library panel was perfectly aligned, that the fake books showed no signs of being disturbed. Margaret cleaned compulsively, scrubbing floors that were already clean, organizing shelves that were already organized. What do we tell them? She asked Friday night. The truth, part of it. We inherited the house, we're living here, we found some money Raymond left behind. What if they ask how much? We tell them what we decided, 50,000. We're using it to fix the place up and live on. They'll want some of it. Harold looked at her. Probably, but it's ours. We inherited it, not them. Saturday arrived cold and grey. Margaret made coffee, set out cookies she'd baked that morning, tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Harold paced, his boots echoing on the concrete floors. The sound of a car engine echoed up the mountain path around 11, then another. They'd both come separately. Jessica arrived first, climbing out of a silver Lexus that looked absurdly out of place in the rugged mountain setting. She was 43 now, blonde hair cut in an expensive style, wearing yoga pants and a North Face jacket. She looked like every other suburban mother Margaret had seen in magazines, successful and distant and carefully maintained. Oh my God, Jessica breathed, looking at the estate. This is incredible. Daniel pulled up moments later in a rental sedan. He was 45, still handsome but soft around the middle, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt like he was trying to look casual but couldn't quite commit. He worked in tech, something Margaret had never fully understood, making money he never seemed to have time to enjoy. Wow, he said, joining his sister. This is actually amazing. What happens next will turn this family reunion into something far more dangerous than Margaret and Harold could have imagined, expose the greed that's been hiding behind years of neglect, and force 2 elderly people to defend not just their fortune but their dignity. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Margaret and Harold stood in the doorway, watching their children stare at the house like it was something that shouldn't exist. Aren't you going to hug us? Jessica finally said, opening her arms. Margaret accepted the embrace, feeling Jessica's expensive perfume and the awkwardness of touching someone who felt like a stranger. Harold shook Daniel's hand, neither of them comfortable enough for more. Come inside, Margaret said. They gave the tour, watching Jessica and Daniel's faces as they moved through the rooms. The massive living area with its stone fireplace, the library with walls of books, the kitchen frozen in the 1970s but impeccably maintained, the bedrooms with their platform beds and geometric light fixtures. This is worth a fortune, Daniel said, not even trying to hide his assessment. The architecture alone, this is a significant property. It's our home, Harold corrected. Right, yes, of course. I just mean, wow, Uncle Raymond really left you something incredible. They sat in the living room, the four of them arranged awkwardly like strangers at a business meeting. Jessica accepted coffee. Daniel declined, neither touched the cookies. So, Jessica began, her voice taking on that careful tone Margaret recognized from years of difficult conversations. Tell us everything. How did this happen? Margaret explained, sticking to the basics. Raymond died. They were his only living relatives. They inherited the property. They decided to move in. And you didn't think to tell us? Daniel asked. You hadn't called in 7 months, Harold said bluntly. Daniel had the decency to look uncomfortable. I've been swamped with work. The company's going through a merger. Too swamped to call your parents? Dad. It's fine, Margaret interrupted, not wanting this to become a fight. Not yet. We managed on our own. We always do. Jessica leaned forward. Mum, we heard you found money here. Is that true? There it was, the real reason they'd come. Raymond had some savings, Margaret said carefully. We found cash he'd set aside over the years. It's helping us get settled. How much? That's private. Mum, we're your children. We're just concerned. At your age, managing money can be complicated. We want to make sure you're being smart about this. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, hot and bitter. We've managed money our entire lives. We raised you on Harold's salary and my teacher's pension. We never asked you for help. But you might need help now, Daniel said. If there's a significant amount of money involved, there are tax implications, legal considerations. I have a friend who's a financial advisor. He could look everything over, make sure you're protected. We don't need protection, Harold said. We need privacy. Dad, come on, be reasonable. Reasonable? Harold's voice rose. You want to talk about reasonable? You didn't visit us for over a year, didn't call for months. Now you show up because you heard we might have some money and you want to be involved. That's not reasonable, that's opportunistic. Daniel stood up. I don't have to listen to this. We came here out of concern. You came here out of greed, Harold shot back. Jessica stood too. This is ridiculous. Mum, Dad, we're trying to help. You're being paranoid. We're being careful, Margaret said quietly. There's a difference. Fine. Jessica grabbed her purse. You don't want our help? You don't get our help, but don't come crying to us when you realize you're in over your heads. They left in a flurry of slammed doors and spinning tires. Margaret and Harold stood in the suddenly silent house, the echo of their children's anger hanging in the air like smoke. Well, Harold said eventually, that went about as well as expected. Margaret started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. Harold pulled her close, and they stood there in the middle of Raymond's brutalist masterpiece, two people who'd just lost their children all over again. But worse was coming. 3 days later, a man in a suit showed up at their door. He was young, maybe 35, with slicked back hair and a briefcase that probably cost more than the truck parked in their driveway. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, he asked, not waiting for an answer. My name is Todd Brennan. I'm an attorney representing the estate planning firm of Morrison and Associates. I need to speak with you about your inheritance. Margaret's blood went cold. What about it? May I come in? They didn't want to let him in, but refusing felt more suspicious than agreeing. They led him to the living room, all three of them sitting in chairs that suddenly felt like interrogation positions. Todd opened his briefcase and pulled out documents. I've been researching the transfer of this property, and I've found some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Harold asked. Raymond Walsh died intestate, meaning without a will. In such cases, North Carolina law dictates a specific order of inheritance. Distant relatives like yourselves are quite far down that chain. I have reason to believe there may be closer relatives who have superior claims to this estate. Like who? Margaret demanded. Todd smiled, and it wasn't friendly. I'm not at liberty to say yet, but I wanted to give you fair warning. My clients will be filing a claim with the probate court. This property may not actually be yours. Martin Caldwell, the estate lawyer, did a full search, Harold said. We're the only living relatives. Martin Caldwell did a cursory search. My firm is more thorough. We've found individuals who may have claims that supersede yours. This is a shakedown, Harold said flatly. Todd's smile widened. This is legal due diligence. Of course, if you'd like to avoid lengthy court proceedings, my clients might be willing to discuss a settlement. You could buy out their interest in the property. Given that you've reportedly found substantial cash on the premises, that shouldn't be difficult. There it was. They'd heard about the money, or heard rumors about the money, and now they were circling like sharks. We found $50,000, Margaret said. That's all, and we're using it to maintain this property. 50,000? Todd looked skeptical. My sources suggest it might be significantly more. Your sources are wrong. Todd stood, tucking his papers back into his briefcase. We'll see what discovery reveals. Expect to hear from us officially within the week. Oh, and one more thing. He pulled out a card. If you do happen to find more assets on this property, there are reporting requirements. Failure to properly document and report found wealth can result in serious legal penalties. I'd hate for you to get into trouble. He left, and the threat hung in the air like poison. Someone told him, Margaret whispered. Someone in town must have exaggerated the story, and now he thinks there's more. Or Jessica and Daniel hired him, Harold said grimly. They left here angry. They think we're hiding something. Maybe they decided to force our hand. Would they do that? Harold looked at her. 5 months ago, would you have thought they'd abandon us completely? That night, they barely slept. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. The estate, which had felt like sanctuary, now felt exposed. In the morning, Harold drove into town and came back with hardware, motion sensors, security cameras, better locks. He spent 3 days installing everything, running wires, setting up a monitoring system in Raymond's office. If anyone comes near this place, we'll know, he said. But the paranoia had settled in. Margaret found herself checking the vault daily, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Harold jumped every time a car engine sounded in the distance, even though they were miles from the nearest road. Then the bank started asking questions. They'd opened a local account to pay property taxes and buy supplies. Small deposits, nothing suspicious, just a few $100s at a time from the cash they'd found. But the bank manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd been polite before, called them in for a meeting. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, she said, her smile professional but cold. I need to ask about your deposits. You've been consistently depositing cash, and we're required to report certain patterns to federal authorities. We found money in the house, Margaret explained again. Raymond's savings. We're just using it as needed. I understand, but cash deposits, especially from elderly individuals who've recently come into property, sometimes indicate exploitation or fraud. I need to verify that you're not being taken advantage of. We're not, Harold said firmly. Then you won't mind providing documentation, bank statements showing the origin of these funds, perhaps an appraisal of the estate. We don't have that. Patricia's smile thinned. Then I'll need to file a suspicious activity report. It's standard procedure. They left the bank feeling hunted. Everywhere they turned, people wanted information, wanted access, wanted to know what they had and how much it was worth. We can't keep living like this, Margaret said that night, constantly looking over our shoulders. What choice do we have? We could leave, take what we can carry and disappear. Harold shook his head. We're too old to run, and I'm tired of being pushed around by people who think they have more right to our life than we do. Then what? We fight. We get better lawyers than Todd, whatever his name. We document everything properly. We stop hiding and start protecting ourselves legally. But before they could act on that plan, everything got worse. They woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of breaking glass. Harold sat up immediately, his heart hammering. Beside him, Margaret grabbed his arm. "Did you hear that?" "Stay here," Harold whispered, reaching for the baseball bat he'd started keeping beside the bed. He crept into the hallway, every sense heightened. The security cameras were in the office, and he'd installed monitors there, but he hadn't thought to put one in the bedroom. Stupid. He should have been more careful. Another sound, this one from the library, footsteps on concrete. Harold's breath caught. Someone was in the house. Someone was inside. He moved as quietly as an 81-year-old man could, his body screaming with every step. Behind him, Margaret followed despite his orders to stay put. He didn't have time to argue. The library door was open. Light from a flashlight danced across the walls. Harold gripped the bat tighter and stepped into the doorway. Two figures stood in front of the bookshelf. They'd already found it, already moved the fake books. One of them was working on the panel, trying to pry it open. "Get out!" Harold said, his voice stronger than he felt. Both figures spun around. In the flashlight beam, Harold saw their faces. Young men, maybe 20, wearing dark clothes and ski masks pushed up on their heads. "Shit," one of them said. "You said they were old. You said they wouldn't wake up." "Who told you that?" Harold demanded. "Who sent you here?" The other one pulled something from his pocket, and Harold's blood went cold. A gun, small, black, pointed directly at him. "Just let us finish," the first one said. "We don't want to hurt you. We just want what's behind that wall." Margaret appeared beside Harold. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "There's nothing back there, just storage." "That's not what we heard. We heard there's a fortune in this house. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. You're just two old people. You don't need that much. Share it, and nobody gets hurt." "And if we don't?" Harold asked. The gun moved closer. "Then maybe this turns into something worse than a robbery?" Harold's mind raced. The bat in his hands was useless against a gun. They were trapped, outmatched, and completely vulnerable. Everything they'd found, everything they'd hoped to protect, was about to be taken by two kids who'd heard rumors and decided old people were easy targets. But Margaret did something unexpected. She started laughing. Both intruders stared at her. Harold stared at her. She laughed until tears ran down her face. "What's wrong with her?" one of the kids asked. "You," Margaret managed between laughs, "you broke into our house because you heard rumors. You're threatening us with a gun for money that might not exist." "It exists," the first one insisted. "Everyone in town knows about it. The old hermit who lived here, he had millions stashed away. You found it when you moved in." Margaret's laughter died. "And who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It does to me." The kids looked at each other, uncertain. This wasn't going how they'd planned. Old people were supposed to be scared, compliant, not laughing at them. Then sirens wailed in the distance. Harold's security system, the motion sensors. They'd triggered an automatic call to the local sheriff's department. Both intruders panicked. The one with the gun swore and ran for the door. The other followed, leaving the panel half open and their flashlights spinning on the floor. Harold and Margaret stood frozen until the sound of engines faded down the mountain. Then they collapsed against each other, shaking with adrenaline and terror and relief. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, 2 deputies with him. They took statements, searched for evidence, promised to investigate. But Harold knew they wouldn't find anything. The kids were probably from out of town, hired by someone who wanted to know what was really in this house. After the law enforcement left, Harold closed and locked the panel. He and Margaret sat in the library as dawn broke over the mountains, neither of them speaking. Finally, Margaret said, "We can't do this alone anymore." Harold nodded. "No, we can't. Tomorrow we find the best lawyers, the best security people, the best financial advisors money can buy. We stop pretending this is just a house with a little bit of cash. We protect what we have, legally and properly. And our kids? Margaret's face hardened. Our kids can find out along with everyone else when we're dead and buried. They don't get to be part of this, not after tonight. Not after abandoning us, then trying to get what we found through lawyers and manipulation and God knows what else. Harold agreed. Their children had made their choice years ago, and now Margaret and Harold were making theirs. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber, two elderly people sat in a fortress filled with secrets and made a decision that would change everything. They were done hiding, done being afraid, done letting other people dictate how they lived and what they deserved. They had $445 million, and now they were going to learn how to use it. Not just to survive, but to fight back against everyone who thought they were too old, too weak, too insignificant to matter. The complications had arrived, but so had their resolve. The law office of Catherine Zhao sat on the 23rd floor of a glass building in Charlotte, 3 hours from the mountain estate. Margaret and Harold had spent a week researching, making calls from untraceable phones they'd bought with cash, asking questions without revealing too much. Catherine's name came up repeatedly, specialist in estate law, inheritance disputes, and asset protection, former prosecutor, reputation for being ruthless but ethical. They made the drive on a Tuesday morning, both dressed in the best clothes they owned. Harold wore a suit he'd bought in 1998 for a funeral. Margaret wore a dress she'd kept for job interviews that never came. They looked like what they were, elderly people trying to appear respectable while carrying secrets worth more than most people would see in 1,000 lifetimes. Catherine's receptionist was kind, offering coffee they were too nervous to drink. When they were finally ushered into the office, Margaret's first thought was that Catherine Zhao looked dangerous. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a suit that probably cost more than their old apartment's yearly rent. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," she said, gesturing to leather chairs. "You were vague on the phone about what you needed. Why don't you tell me everything, and I'll tell you if I can help?" Margaret and Harold looked at each other. They'd practiced this moment, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible. "We inherited property from a distant relative," Harold began. 80 acres in the mountains with a house built in the 1970s. When we moved in, we found something. Catherine leaned forward slightly. "What did you find?" "A vault," Margaret said. "Hidden behind a wall. Inside was cash, gold, stocks, bonds, artwork, jewelry." "How much?" Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. $445 million. Catherine's expression didn't change. She picked up a pen and made a note. "And you haven't reported this?" "We didn't know how," Harold admitted. "We're terrified. Our own children have turned against us. Someone broke into our house last week looking for it. A lawyer is threatening to challenge our inheritance. The bank is filing suspicious activity reports. We're being hunted by people who think we're sitting on money we can't defend." "Are you sitting on money you can't defend?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "We're 81 and 78 years old. We've never dealt with anything like this. We're smart enough to know we need help, but we don't know who to trust." Catherine set down her pen. "Let me be direct. If what you're telling me is true, you're in serious danger. Not just from criminals, but from the IRS, from potential heirs, from your own family. Money like that doesn't stay hidden, and when it comes out, everyone will want a piece." "We know," Harold said. "That's why we're here." "What do you want? To keep it all? To give it away? To hide it?" Margaret thought about that question. They'd talked about it every night for weeks, lying in Raymond's bed, staring at the ceiling. What did they want? "We want to not be victims anymore," Margaret said finally. "We want to use this money to help people like us. Elderly people who've been abandoned, forgotten, treated like burdens. We want to create something that lasts beyond us. But we also want to live comfortably for whatever time we have left without constantly looking over our shoulders. Catherine studied them for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was genuine. I can work with that, but it's going to be complicated, expensive, and very public. Are you prepared for that? We don't have a choice, Harold said. Everyone has a choice. You could walk away from this, refuse the inheritance, let the state figure it out. No, Margaret said firmly. Raymond left this for us, for whoever came next and proved they cared enough to find it. We found it. It's ours, and we're not walking away. Catherine's smile widened. Good, then let's get to work. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Margaret and Harold's lives. Catherine brought in specialists, forensic accountants, tax attorneys, estate planners, security consultants. They descended on the mountain estate like an army, documenting everything, photographing every item, cataloguing every stock certificate and bearer bond. The cash alone took 4 days to count properly. $11,900,000 in bills ranging from 1973 to 2018. All legal, all traceable to Raymond's accounts over the years. He'd been slowly converting assets to cash, preparing for something he'd never lived to see. The stocks were worth more than anyone expected. Raymond had invested early in companies that became giants. Apple shares bought in 1982, Microsoft from 1986, Amazon from 1997. He'd held them through every crash and bubble, never selling, just accumulating. Current value, $217 million. The bearer bonds, many of them matured, were worth another $68 million. The gold, $720,000. The artwork, conservatively, $15 million. The jewelry, $3 million. Total verified value, $447,235,000. Margaret cried when they gave her the final number. Not from joy, but from the weight of it. This was real. This was happening. Their lives would never be small again. Catherine handled the legal filings with precision. They reported the found assets to the IRS immediately, along with full documentation of the inheritance. They paid the estate taxes up front, 40% of everything, leaving them with approximately $268 million after the government took its share. That's still more money than you can spend in 5 lifetimes, Catherine noted. Now we protect it. They established a foundation, the Walsh Legacy Fund for Abandoned Elderly. Its mission, to provide housing, medical care, legal assistance, and community support for senior citizens who'd been neglected by their families. Catherine helped them create an ironclad structure with Margaret and Harold as lifetime directors, but professional managers handling day-to-day operations. They transferred the bulk of the wealth into the foundation, $200 million. It would generate enough investment income to help thousands of people while preserving the principal forever. The remaining $68 million they kept in a personal trust. Enough to live comfortably, to travel if they wanted, to never worry about money again. But not so much that they'd lose themselves in wealth. Now comes the hard part, Catherine said. We go public. The press conference was Catherine's idea. You control the narrative or it controls you, she'd explained. Right now, you're victims of rumor. We're going to make you something else. They held it at the Foundation's newly established headquarters in Asheville, a renovated historic building that would serve as the main office. Margaret and Harold sat at a table facing a room full of journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers. Catherine stood beside them, fierce and protective. Margaret read from a statement she'd written herself, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. My name is Margaret Walsh. I'm 78 years old. 6 months ago, my husband and I were living in a cramped apartment, barely surviving on Social Security, abandoned by our children who decided we were too much trouble to care about. We inherited property from a distant relative, and when we moved in, we discovered a fortune hidden by a man who understood loneliness and wanted to give whoever came next a second chance. Today we're announcing the Walsh Legacy Fund, a foundation dedicated to helping elderly Americans who've been forgotten by their families and ignored by society. We're funding community centers, legal aid, medical assistance, and housing programs in every state. We're not doing this because we're saints. We're doing it because we know what it feels like to be invisible. To the people who tried to take this from us, who broke into our home, who hired lawyers to intimidate us, who pretended to care only when they thought there was money involved, you taught us that family is a choice, not an obligation, and we choose to build a family with thousands of people we'll never meet but who deserve dignity in their final years. This money isn't ours. It never was. It belongs to everyone who's been told they don't matter anymore. We're just the ones lucky enough to make sure it reaches them. The room exploded with questions. Catherine fielded most of them, but Harold answered one himself. Mr. Walsh, your children haven't been mentioned. Will they be involved in the foundation? Harold looked directly into the camera. My children made their choice years ago when they decided their parents weren't worth their time. They don't get to change that choice now that there's money involved. This foundation is for people who need help, not people who want handouts. The story went viral within hours. Elderly couple finds fortune, gives it away. Local news picked it up, then national, then international. Within 2 days, Margaret and Harold Walsh were famous. And then the children came. Jessica showed up first, crying, apologetic, saying she'd made terrible mistakes and wanted to make amends. Daniel flew in the next day with similar pleas. They'd seen the news. They'd seen the numbers. They wanted back in. Margaret and Harold met them in the foundation's conference room with Catherine present. "I'm glad you came," Margaret said calmly, "because there are things we need to say to each other." Jessica wiped her eyes. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I was selfish and cruel, and I abandoned you when you needed me most." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "You did." Daniel leaned forward. "We want to help with the foundation. We want to be part of this. We want to make things right." "By doing what?" Harold asked. "By getting your names attached to a charity worth $200 million? By telling people you're involved so you look generous?" "That's not fair," Jessica protested. "Isn't it?" Margaret's voice was steel. "You didn't call for 5 months, 7 months in Daniel's case. You showed up at the estate only when you heard there might be money. You sent lawyers after us. And now that we've gone public, now that the money is secured and the foundation established, suddenly you want to be involved?" "We made mistakes," Daniel said quietly. "But we're still your children." "Are you?" Harold stood up. "Because for the last 2 years, you've treated us like inconveniences, like embarrassments, like people you couldn't wait to put in a home and forget about." "We were scared," Jessica admitted. "Scared of losing you, scared of the responsibility, scared of becoming like you. That stopped them both." Margaret looked at her daughter. "Like us? Old, alone, struggling." Jessica's voice broke. "I watched you get smaller every year, watched the light go out of your eyes. I couldn't handle it, so I ran away instead." For the first time, Margaret felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "We were struggling because you let us struggle alone," she said softly. "We would have been less alone if you'd just called, just visited, just remembered we existed." They sat in heavy silence. Then Harold spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Here's what's going to happen. You're not getting money from us. Not now, probably not ever. The foundation is locked tight, and Catherine made sure it stays that way. But if you want to be part of our lives again, if you genuinely want to repair what's been broken, you can try. We'll have dinner once a month. You'll call once a week. You'll show up not because you want something, but because you care." "And if we do that," Daniel asked, "then maybe eventually we'll remember what it felt like to be a family. But that's years away, Daniel, years of proving you mean it." Jessica nodded slowly. "We'll do it, whatever it takes." They left, and Margaret wasn't sure if she believed them. But she'd offered something she hadn't expected to, a chance. Not for the children they'd been, but for the adults they might become. The foundation launched officially 3 months later. By then, they'd opened 5 community centers, hired 23 staff members, and helped 87 elderly individuals with legal issues, medical bills, and housing assistance. Letters poured in daily, thank you notes, requests for help, stories of abandonment and hope. Margaret spent her mornings answering letters at the foundation office. Harold worked on expanding programs and partnering with other organizations. They'd hired a brilliant young woman named Sarah as executive director, freeing them to focus on vision rather than logistics. They still lived at the estate, but it felt different now. No longer a fortress to defend, but a home to enjoy. They'd upgraded the security, yes, but they'd also added comfortable furniture, modern appliances, a garden where Margaret grew vegetables in the summer. One evening, 6 months after the press conference, they sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors. Jack came by weekly now, joining them for dinner and storytelling. He'd become more than a friend. He'd become family, the chosen kind. Raymond would have loved this, Jack said, sipping whiskey from one of Raymond's crystal glasses. All those years he spent alone, building something permanent. Turns out, he built exactly what the world needed. Margaret thought about that, about Raymond's loneliness transforming into purpose, about how his pain had become their salvation and their salvation had become hope for thousands. "We're not going to live forever," she said quietly. "Harold and we've got maybe 10 good years left if we're lucky." "So make them count," Jack replied. "We're trying." And they were. They traveled some. Harold wanted to see the ocean again, so they spent a week in Charleston. Margaret wanted to visit the Library of Congress, so they drove to Washington. Small trips, manageable trips, but adventures nonetheless. They also taught. Margaret started a financial literacy program at the foundation, teaching elderly people how to manage money, spot scams, protect themselves. Harold led workshops on home repair and safety modifications. They shared what they'd learned from nearly 8 decades of living. Jessica and Daniel kept their word, at first awkwardly, then with increasing genuine effort. Monthly dinners became easier. Weekly calls less strained. They'd never be the family they'd once been. That bridge had burned too thoroughly. But they were building something new, smaller, more honest, less assumed. A year after finding the vault, Margaret stood in the library looking at the hidden panel. They'd left it accessible but secured with a proper safe instead of just a combination lock. Inside now were family documents, Raymond's journals, and a letter they'd written together. "To whoever finds this next," it began. "We were 2 people the world forgot. We found fortune and chose not to let it make us small. We built something larger than ourselves, and it saved us. If you're reading this, you're probably at a crossroads too. Choose wisely. Choose generously. Choose life over fear." Signed, Margaret and Harold Walsh. They'd also left instructions. When they died, the estate would become a retreat center for elderly artists, writers, and thinkers. A place where people in their final chapters could create, reflect, and be supported. Raymond's fortress of solitude would become a sanctuary of community. The foundation grew. By the 2nd year, they'd helped over 2,000 people. By the 3rd year, they'd expanded internationally, partnering with organizations in 6 countries. Other wealthy individuals, inspired by their story, contributed funds. The 200 million had grown to 350 million. Margaret and Harold watched it all with quiet pride. They'd never wanted fame, and they'd learned to navigate it carefully. They did interviews occasionally, always bringing the focus back to the people they served. They wrote a book, From Abandoned to Abundant, a memoir that donated all proceeds to the foundation. And they lived, really lived. Not just survived, not just existed, but thrived in ways they'd never imagined at their age. Harold started painting, something he'd never tried before. His work was abstract, full of mountain colors and emotional depth. Margaret wrote poetry, simple verses about age and renewal that were published in literary magazines. They made new friends through the foundation, volunteers, staff members, people they'd helped who became helpers themselves. Their world, once so small and lonely, had exploded into something rich and textured and full. On their 40th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows at the estate. Jack officiated. Sarah and the foundation staff attended. Even Jessica and Daniel came, bringing their own children, grandchildren Margaret and Harold barely knew but were slowly learning to love. Standing before everyone, Harold took Margaret's hand. 40 years ago, I married the smartest woman I'd ever met. Today, I'm married to the bravest. Margaret smiled. 40 years ago, I married a man who knew how to fix anything. Today, I know he can fix anything, including us. They kissed and everyone cheered, and for a moment, the weight of their journey lifted. They weren't two elderly people fighting to survive. They were two souls who'd found each other, lost almost everything, then built something extraordinary from the ruins. 3 years after finding the vault, Margaret woke up one morning and couldn't get out of bed. Her heart, the doctor said, not failing but struggling. Harold held her hand in the hospital, his own hands shaking with age and fear. "I'm not done yet," she told him fiercely. "I know," he said. "You've still got work to do." She recovered, but it was a reminder. Their time was finite. They revised their wills, secured the foundation's future, made sure everything would continue when they were gone. But they didn't stop living. If anything, Margaret's scare made them more determined. They established a scholarship program for elderly people wanting to return to school. They funded a documentary about ageism in America. They started a legal defense fund for seniors facing elder abuse. Every new program was another way to say, you matter, you deserve dignity, you are not forgotten. Anyone can find treasure buried beneath broken floors, but it takes courage to turn that treasure into something that heals not just yourself, but everyone who's ever felt invisible, abandoned, and left behind. As the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains one evening, Margaret and Harold sat on their terrace, now weathered by years but still strong just like them. They were 81 and 84 now, moving slower, seeing less clearly, but burning brighter than ever. Below them, the foundation thrived. Around them, the estate hummed with life they'd breathed into it. Behind them, the vault sat empty but meaningful, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. "We did good, didn't we?" Margaret asked. "We did better than good," Harold replied. "We took something meant to be hidden and made it shine. And somewhere in that mountain fortress, built by a lonely genius, surrounded by a legacy they'd crafted from abandonment and fortune, two people who'd been discarded by the world proved something profound. That it's never too late to matter, never too late to build, never too late to take the broken pieces of your life and forge them into something that lights the way for others stumbling in the dark. The elderly couple who'd been abandoned had found more than money in that vault. They'd found purpose, dignity, and the power to transform pain into hope for thousands. Because for Margaret and Harold Walsh, the greatest fortune wasn't the $445 million. It was remembering finally that they deserved to take up space in the world, and that space could be filled with love, legacy, and the revolutionary act of refusing to disappear quietly. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will remind you why resilience matters and second chances exist. Click to keep discovering with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe forgotten dreams still deserve to soar.